The year 2000 was supposed to mark a new beginning for my family. After years of living cramped at my grandmother's house, my parents finally found the perfect apartment, a spacious four-room flat on the 9th floor of an old building. It was a dream come true, and the price was unbelievable, nearly half of what similar apartments were going for in that building. My parents didn't hesitate. They signed the paperwork almost immediately, thrilled with their good fortune. On move-in day, we arrived at the 9th floor, standing in front of a large, black door with the number 103 scrawled on it in faded paint. The door loomed before us, dark and imposing, but we were too excited to care. I was 10 years old, and for the first time in my life I had my own room. I felt like the luckiest kid in the world. At first, everything seemed normal. I made new friends quickly, and my parents were happy to have their own space. But something felt off, something subtle that I couldn't quite place. The other residents of the building seemed strange. They avoided eye contact, whispering to each other whenever we passed. If we tried to say hello, they would mumble something and hurry away. At night, strange noises echoed through the walls. Sounds of furniture scraping, faint whispers, and sometimes even distant screams. Our neighbors began complaining to the building management, saying they heard constant rumbling, as if furniture was being dragged across our floor in the middle of the night, even though we weren't moving anything. Then, about a month in, things started to unravel. My parents, who had always been close, began fighting over the smallest things. My father, usually mild and patient, would come home and explode at my mother over trivial matters. The tension in the apartment grew thick, like a storm cloud hovering over us. It didn't help that the apartment itself seemed to resist light. Even on sunny days, when my mother threw open the windows, the rooms remained dim, as if the walls absorbed the sunlight. One night, during a violent storm, something happened that I would never forget. It was the first time I felt true fear in apartment 103. It was a stormy night, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and casting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light. I was curled up on the couch, watching TV, trying to ignore the eerie atmosphere of the apartment. My mother came and sat beside me, wrapping her arms around me in a comforting hug. We stayed like that for a while, and I eventually drifted off to sleep, feeling her warmth against my back. Sometime later, through the haze of sleep, I heard the front door creak open. My mind registered it as my father coming home. I heard the soft thud of shoes being removed, the quiet footsteps as he moved closer. I relaxed, thinking he'd come to join us on the couch. But then, I felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck. In that moment, I became aware that the person behind me, the one holding me, felt different, colder, stiffer. I dared not move, feeling a mounting sense of dread. My mother's embrace, which had been warm and comforting just moments before, now felt alien, wrong. Suddenly, a voice called from the hallway, shattering the silence. "It's me!" I turned around, and standing in the doorway was my father, looking at us with confusion. The light from the hall spilled into the room, momentarily blinding me. When my eyes adjusted, I realized with horror that the figure holding me had vanished. There was no one there. My father looked at me with concern. "Where's your mother?" he asked. "She was right here," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. But the figure, whoever or whatever it was, had disappeared. My father turned on the living room light, hugging me tightly as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Then, my real mother emerged from the bedroom, looking disoriented and concerned. She asked what was going on, and I told them everything, my words tumbling over each other as I tried to explain. My mother confirmed that she had been in the bedroom the entire time, resting. My father looked pale, but he didn't say anything. He simply pulled me into a tighter embrace. I thought that was the end of it, just a strange, isolated incident. But I couldn't have been more wrong. After that night, an oppressive atmosphere settled over apartment 103. No matter what we did, the apartment remained cold and damp, as though it were sealed off from the world outside. Even on the sunniest days, it felt like the light couldn't penetrate the thick, heavy darkness that clung to the walls. My mother tried everything, scrubbing the windows, changing the curtains, lighting candles. But nothing helped. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing in the light and leaving us trapped in shadows. Stranger still were the sounds. Every night, without fail, I heard faint whispers coming from my bedroom closet. The sounds were muffled, like someone was whispering just beyond the wall. I would lie in bed, frozen in fear, straining to understand the words, but they were always too faint. It was as if the voices were intentionally keeping me on edge, reminding me that I was never truly alone. My parents weren't spared either. My father, once a kind and easygoing man, grew increasingly agitated and short-tempered. He began staying out late, coming home only after midnight, and when he did, he was tense, barely speaking to us. My mother spent her days cleaning obsessively, trying to scrub away the darkness that seemed to seep into every corner. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard heavy footsteps pacing in the hallway. I assumed it was my father. But then I remembered, he was supposed to be on a business trip that night, and my mother was fast asleep. The footsteps continued, back and forth, an endless rhythm that grew louder with each step. Gathering my courage, I crept out of bed and opened my door. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, echoing down the corridor, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped. From the silence, I heard a whisper, clear and unmistakable, coming from the empty hallway. "Get out!" I slammed my door shut, my heart pounding, and prayed for morning. The tension in the apartment was becoming unbearable. My parents fought constantly, the strange noises grew louder, and the damp coldness never left. One evening, my father returned home with a grim look on his face. He sat us down and told us what he had discovered. Through a friend at work, my father had learned that apartment 103 had a dark history. The previous occupants had left abruptly, abandoning the apartment under mysterious circumstances. And they weren't the only ones. Over the years, every family that had lived in apartment 103 had left within months, each one reporting strange occurrences, fights, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Rumor had it that several people had gone missing in the building, vanishing without a trace. One story in particular sent a chill through us. Decades ago, in the late 1970s, a young woman had been found dead in apartment 103. She had been living alone, and her death was ruled as natural causes. But neighbors claimed they had heard her screaming for days before she was found. Some even swore they had seen her standing in the window, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Hearing this, my mother looked at my father, fear evident in her eyes. We knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a series of coincidences. Something was wrong with apartment 103, something that went beyond reason or logic. My father decided that we would move out as soon as possible. But until we could make arrangements, we were trapped. That night, I slept with the lights on, hoping that the morning would come quickly. But instead, something happened that would change everything. On what would be our last night in apartment 103, a thick fog seemed to settle over the building, muffling every sound. My father was out late, making arrangements for us to stay with relatives until we could find another place. My mother and I sat on the couch, tense and exhausted. Suddenly, we heard a loud banging on the door. My mother got up to open it, expecting my father, but when she opened the door, no one was there. Just the empty hallway, shrouded in shadows. She closed the door, looking uneasy, and sat back down. Moments later, the banging resumed, louder and more insistent. This time, I felt a chill run down my spine. My mother tried to ignore it, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Finally, we heard footsteps entering the apartment, heavy and deliberate, making their way toward the living room. Then, from the darkness of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was my father, or at least it looked like him. He walked slowly, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on us without blinking. But something about him was wrong, almost hollow. "Where have you been?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. The figure just stared, unblinking, silent. At that moment, the real front door opened, and my father stepped in, his face weary but relieved to see us. The figure in the hallway vanished as he entered, leaving only an empty shadow. The next morning, we left apartment 103 and never looked back. No one bought it, despite the price being lowered repeatedly. Eventually, the building was condemned and scheduled for demolition. Years later, we heard that human remains were found in the rubble, old bones buried in the walls and floors, as if the building itself had swallowed them whole. To this day, I don't know what haunted us in apartment 103, but I know one thing for certain: whatever it was glad to see us leave. And it's something I pray we'll never encounter again. After leaving apartment 103, we thought we had escaped the horrors that plagued us. We stayed with my grandmother for a few months, hoping to move on and forget the unsettling experiences in that cursed place. But it seemed that apartment 103 was not done with us. It started subtly. In the middle of the night, I would hear the familiar faint tapping sound against my bedroom window, just like I'd heard in the old apartment. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. But then, my parents began experiencing strange things, too. My mother started finding muddy footprints in the hallway, leading from the front door to her bedroom. She would scrub them away, only for them to reappear the next morning. My father would wake up drenched in cold sweat, claiming he'd heard someone calling his name in a voice eerily similar to his own. We were no longer in apartment 103, but it seemed the darkness had followed us. My grandmother, who had grown increasingly concerned by our behavior, suggested we visit a local historian who specialized in old properties. Perhaps he could help us understand the curse that had attached itself to our family. The historian listened to our story with grave attention. After we'd finished, he looked at us solemnly and said, "Apartment 103 is infamous around here. That building was constructed on land with a dark past, a burial ground for unidentified bodies from a mass tragedy in the 1930s. Many of those souls were never laid to rest properly, and the property has been cursed ever since." He paused, his gaze intense. "The apartment is like a vortex, drawing lost souls back to it. By living there, you may have invited something dark into your lives, something that will try to pull you back into its grasp." His words sent a chill through us. The apartment wasn't just haunted. It was a place of confinement for restless spirits, and somehow we had become part of its curse. After our meeting with the historian, my nights were plagued by nightmares. The same dream repeated itself, vivid and horrifying. In the dream, I was back in apartment 103, standing in the living room, surrounded by shadows. The air was thick with a foul odor, and I could hear a chorus of whispers, like dozens of voices trying to speak all at once. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispers grew louder, forming words, calling my name in a pleading tone. "Help us! Don't leave us here." Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, with hollow eyes and a face twisted in agony. Her clothes were torn, and she held out her hand toward me, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to scream. She pointed toward the floor, her bony finger trembling. I looked down and saw a faint outline, like the shape of a body, burned into the wood. And then I understood. Beneath the floors of apartment 103, there were bodies. People who had been buried there, forgotten, trapped in eternal darkness. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding in terror. The nightmare didn't feel like just a dream, felt like a warning. The souls in that apartment were still there, and they wanted us to remember. My parents could see the toll the nightmares were taking on me. We tried to ignore it, to pretend it was all in the past. But the curse lingered in our lives, like a shadow we couldn't escape. One evening, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the company overseeing the demolition of the building that housed apartment 103. To our shock, the letter informed us that the demolition was postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. They didn't explain further, but a local newspaper reported that several workers had quit after claiming they'd heard voices while working on the site. My father, visibly disturbed by the news, suggested we visit the building one last time. He believed that confronting the apartment would allow us to finally break the curse that was haunting our family. My mother and I were reluctant, but after weeks of experiencing strange occurrences in our new home, we agreed. When we arrived, the building stood as silent as a tomb, shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The windows of apartment 103 seemed to stare down at us like hollow eyes, watching, waiting. We made our way up to the 9th floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. When we reached the door marked 103, I felt a surge of dread. My father reached out to touch the handle, and as his hand made contact, the door swung open on its own, revealing the cold, empty interior of the apartment. Inside, everything was exactly as we had left it, as if time had frozen. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth. And then we heard it. A faint whispering, echoing from the walls, the same voices from my nightmare, pleading, crying. "Help us, find us." My father took a step forward, his face pale. "This is where it all began," he murmured, his voice shaking. "And it's where it needs to end." Determined to put an end to the haunting, we searched the apartment, following the whispers that seemed to grow louder the deeper we went. The voices led us to a small, dusty closet at the end of the hallway, a place I had always avoided, though I never knew why. Now, standing in front of it, I felt a terrible, suffocating pressure in my chest. My father forced the closet door open, revealing an empty, hollow space. But as he knocked on the floor, we heard a strange echo. The floor was hollow. Without hesitation, he began pulling up the floorboards, revealing a small, hidden chamber beneath. Inside, we found what looked like a stack of old, brittle papers in a box, rusted with age. My father carefully lifted it out, and we opened it together. Inside the box were photographs, letters, and items of personal belongings. But what horrified us most was the final discovery. A small, dried-up handprint, burned into the bottom of the box, as if someone had pressed their hand there in desperation. The photographs showed faces of people who had once lived in the building, faces twisted in pain, their eyes wide with fear. And in each photograph, a shadowy figure stood behind them, a dark shape that resembled the hollow-eyed figure from my dream. It was then that we realized these were the belongings of the people whose bodies had been buried beneath apartment 103. Their spirits had been bound to the building, trapped by the darkness that lingered there. With a growing sense of horror, we understood what needed to be done. These souls had been calling for help, desperate to be freed from the grip of apartment 103. Their remains needed to be brought to light, their stories told, so they could finally find peace. We gathered the belongings and, with the help of the historian, arranged for the remains to be exhumed and given a proper burial. As each artifact was removed from the building, the air grew lighter, as if a heavy weight was lifting. The voices grew softer, until finally, there was only silence. A month later, the building was successfully demolished. The news reported that several human remains had been found in the rubble, bones hidden in the walls and floors, some dating back decades. The story of the haunted apartment made headlines, and the souls of those who had been lost were finally laid to rest. After that, the strange occurrences stopped. The shadows that had followed us disappeared, and the nightmares faded. For the first time in months, our family found peace. It was as if a dark chapter had closed, and we could finally move on. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel a chill run down my spine, a reminder of apartment 103. And when I close my eyes, I can still see those hollow faces in my dreams, watching, waiting. I've learned to live with the memories, though, because I know that somewhere, beneath the earth, the spirits of apartment 103 have finally found peace.